Friends, you might remember this wall behind me from last year. The building was bought by a developer and it's about to be turned into an apartment complex, so I decided to make it eternal in the form of a miniature. And here's the kicker. You can too! It's an absolute pleasure to tell you that this is my first commercial model kit. Let's take a closer look. The kit is developed in cooperation with RT Diorama, and what I have here right now is a pre-production copy which I had to paint for the box art. You'll get some printed details, a lot of 3D printed parts which were modeled by Tom from RT Diorama, and a plaster wall with small base which was made by me and cast in ceramic plaster. I developed the original concept of the wall and the master, which was made from foam board, putty and plastic. Tom did the casting and we were both blown away by how much detail was reproduced, and by much I mean pretty much everything. I also designed the base to click in place like a jigsaw, although we'll talk about this part later. The 3D parts are a work of art, and I love how Tom went to town when I told him that everything should look more neglected and DIY, as if some parts were repaired by random scraps you'd find in your shed. You also get a satin sheet of enameled signs, although these are a bit too large, but their size will be fixed in the official release. Pre-weathered windows printed on clear acetate sheet are a fantastic accessory, and lastly, plywood sheets printed on matte paper are something I came up with because I find it almost impossible to replicate fresh plywood realistically with paints and brushes. Okay, let's get the wall ready for painting, and if you're stoked, check the pre-order link in the description. I was told that pre-production casts often have more air bubbles, but as the mold breaks in, so to say, the issue goes away. However, I find these to be an opportunity rather than annoyance, because a few scuffs with a hobby blade turn those bubbles into fragmented bricks, which are slowly falling apart. It's a quick fix and makes the wall more unique. I also included an electric cable in my original master, but this one was too problematic to cast in silicone. I didn't know that, and it's a learning experience for both of us. You can leave your wall without it, just carefully break it off. But if you enjoy some simple scratch building, replacing it with lengths of copper wire is a quick fix. We'll integrate them properly later. And that's pretty much it, we can start painting. First off, a generous coat of the new VMS primer to make the ceramic plaster less porous and absorbent. I can't recommend these primers enough, so I'll leave you a link down below as well. From a visual standpoint, the facade is much easier to look at, and we can appreciate all those details better. Let's start by painting the concrete. Here I used my standard color palette of grayish, brown, sandy and off-white colors. It's a great starting point because most of the work is done with sponges, and honestly, it's one of those techniques that is hard to mess up. There's not even a proper order of paints, but I like to start with those that are darkest and finish with the lightest. The effect indeed looks nothing like concrete at first, and the initial steps can feel horrendous, but once you start applying the lighter shades, it'll slowly start coming together. The same effect is applied to the base, which will differentiate from the rest at the end of the project. But this isn't quite it. An equally important step is to flood the surface with diluted enamel wash, and I prefer this sepia tone from AK, which isn't quite black, but not grey either. Also, it should be diluted, because otherwise it would darken the surface too much. Lastly, once the wash dries, we take a pointy paintbrush and bring out some of the textures, edges, protruding details, all the sharp stuff. This way we'll give the concrete more definition. So far so good, although the difference isn't the most obvious, but it's a good way to spend a late evening. Let's now paint the bricks. For these, I use a semi-standard palette, which means I often switch up those orange tones and always change the final look using dusty colors, which I use for weathering. Instead of painting each brick in different color, which leads to a ton of contrast but can feel exhausting and not quite fun, I like to paint them in these so-called zones. The idea is that when the real factory was built, the workers were taking bricks from different batches, which led to this interesting effect. I did it on my first facade and the painting was much quicker. We're blocking in the basic colors, and we'll add all the variation we need later. It doesn't look like much right now, but let me turn it into the final effect in 3 simple steps. The first one is again dark sepia enamel wash. This step has the same purpose as on the concrete, but we can apply it much thicker and let it collect in those brick lines. By the way, I didn't know at first if I should add mortar to my initial sculpt or not, but I figured that not every modeler would find it fun to add it themselves, or know the right medium, so this step helps to outline all those mortar lines as well. It also changes the tone of the bricks, and we can control it further with enamel thinner and a clean brush. But there's no point spending too much time here. Instead, we can let it dry and go over the bricks one more time with diluted acrylics. Now we're adding variation, weathering, and the final lightness of the wall. As such, I prefer using dusty colors such as light earth or deck tan for this step, although a few flesh or orange tones can be used as well, depending on the look you're after. So that's 2 steps out of the bunch, and it already looks way better, doesn't it? The final step, of course, is painting the mortar. For this, I used a very light gray acrylic. At first, I thought this would take ages, but turns out the sculptor did a great job and painting the mortar was a breeze. Wink wink. The dark wash helps us with artificial shading, so we just have to focus on the most raised portions, and picking those out is very easy. Not to mention how you can choose the intensity of the mortar yourself and end up with a completely different effect. There are many options at every single step. So that's the brickwork finished, and you might not believe me when I tell you that these were so far the easiest and quickest surfaces to finish. It only gets more complicated from here, but complicated doesn't mean it's not gonna be fun. Let's finish the remaining details on the wall. In the past, I used white acrylic putty for the cement, but on this wall, I tried using acrylic snow paste from AK, and let me tell you, it's the ultimate medium for the job. Overall, cement has a slightly different color from concrete. It can be more white or slightly grayish, while concrete often has that warm, sandy tone. As such, an off-white base coat is ideal for these surfaces, followed by several quick washes of dark sepia enamel paint. The more texture you have, the easier it is to paint, but not all surfaces are extra gnarly. This is another way of visual storytelling, as the smoothed out surfaces were done when the building was constructed, and the slapped on cement was most likely some rudimentary repair years later. Either way, similarly to the concrete technique, an off-white acrylic paint and a pointy paintbrush will enhance the texture, add lightness, and bring some depth to the effect. Metal surfaces that are cast with the wall were quickly base coated with AK's wrought brown acrylic, and the openings were all darkened with the black VMS primer. We need absolute blackness in these areas if we want to sell the fake depth effect on the final piece, and besides, it looks pretty cool like that. So yeah, that's the finished wall section, and despite this being the largest piece of the kit, it was also the quickest to paint. Let's now focus on the 3D printed parts, which will add delicacy to the wall. There are many ways to deal with the supports, and Tom suggested a hairdryer. Hot water is a common method, but hot air is indeed more efficient, as you don't have to wait for the parts to dry. Heat softens the resin, which weakens the joint between the parts and the supports, and it also makes the material flexible, greatly reducing any chance of causing accidental damage. However, with large and thin parts, we might encounter a problem when they become warped and misshapen. That's no good, but luckily, Tom once again told me that if I cured and taped to a sturdy flat surface, everything will be fixed. You can put them out into the sunlight for an hour or so, but things get even better and quicker if you have one of these UV curing stations. That did the job, although the gate was a bit stubborn. I mean, it's bent in all directions on the real factory, but to rectify the issue, a piece of MDF board will be included in the kit as a reinforcement. On my model, I used 2mm styrene. There's not much assembly after this point, just a few parts that are held together with superglue and we're good to go. Once again, we'll start the job with primers. Dark mahogany tone on all the metal parts, acting as an undercoat for the rust effects, and white on the wooden details as a base coat for wood. Let's finish the windows first. These are pretty easy to paint as they don't feature any large rusty surfaces, so the effects can be kept rather simple. A few messy acrylic washes will do the job for the initial layer. Now we cover the entire frame with a generous coat of VMS chipping fluid, allowing it to fully dry before proceeding. The good thing about smaller surfaces with heavy chipping is that we can slap the paint without much care, and despite the hasty application, the results will be still good. Truly, the main objective here is to have lots of sharply defined remnants of faded blue paint, and because these old windows are always heavily corroded, a huge amount of chipping is always the best result. To make it look somewhat refined, I quickly went over the raised details with wrought brown acrylic using the dry brushing method. For the next steps, we'll employ some rust-colored oil paints and a bit of yellow for good measure. Again, this step is just as much fun as the previous ones. It's just applying random rust washes without too much care. Of course, our main goal is to have a good time, but details like these make it extra easy. The pre-weathered glass panels speed up the entire process, but it's not just the weathering effects. The printed guidelines allow us to get the right dimensions right from the get-go, although here we also had to iron out a few kinks in this pre-production version. As always, I fixed them in place with tiny amounts of superglue, because in larger amounts, it can frost the glass as it dries. I love how it replicates the blue reflection from my reference images, but that doesn't mean we can't adjust them further, such as I'm doing here with diluted dark sepia acrylic paint. The glass will frost over while it's wet, but it'll dry to a clear finish, so don't get scared. It wouldn't be me if I didn't add some remnants of paint applied over chipping fluid from the other side. This is used to block out the view from the outside while letting sunlight to come in, and it's a quick, crusty effect that adds more visual interest. Finally, we can add the printed plywood sheets. It's not obligatory, you can keep them for another project, but I was so stoked about them that I just couldn't resist. Just make sure the cuts are painted over with acrylics so there's no white paper on the edges, and I think they're visible just enough through the dirty windows. And they can be simply attached to the wall with superglue. Another kink we had to iron out was the size of the upper floor window, which was a bit too small. Not an issue for me, I simply filled the gap with cement. This is common practice on all windows, even modern ones, although nowadays expanding polyurethane foam is more common, but it's all fixed in the official release. Okay, now we can paint the wooden details, and the base coat will be done with oil paints. This is one of my favorite methods because it's so sloppy, easy, and the results are amazing. We apply them thick, almost undiluted, like some horrible oil dot filter, and then we blend them following the direction of the wood grain. It's smart to leave the paint dry for at least a day, and in the meantime, I was painting the windows. Once the oils were rock hard in the morning, I gave them a quick wash with diluted black acrylic. Then a generous coat of chipping fluid, and again, it has to be completely dry before we move further. The amount of chip paint on the individual planks, and especially the color variation, is a subjective thing and a matter of everyone's taste. Truth be told, it wasn't very common to paint wood in Slovakia, definitely not in vivid colors, and yes, the effect is totally over the top, downright cartoonish, but I simply like to make the most out of every wooden board. I chipped most of the paint down anyway, partially because I didn't want the trapdoor to look like a Jamaican flag, and partially because I'm all about that heavy wear. Besides, we can enhance the effect of raw, aged wood with this technique as well, we just have to choose more natural colors. Old wood is probably one of the very few subjects in miniature where variation is pretty much endless. And we have every step in the process that we can use to expand the variation even further. The amount of different colors, how heavy the chipping is, how much black wash we apply between the boards and into the wood grain, how much additional fine chipping and highlighting we apply. Each of these will significantly affect the final look, so it's good to know the basic steps and then use them to your advantage. The metal details on these parts are rather small but beautifully done. I base coated them in the same dark rusty color as the windows and added just a small amount of visual steel texture with the light grey acrylic. Finally, rust washes mixed with oils finished the job. This might be one of my favorite details on this facade. In real life, it was used to drop sacks of flour into dump trucks because the real building wasn't a factory, but a grain mill. Next, we have more corroded details, but these are also pretty small and quite fiddly when it comes to their handling. Hairspray chipping was used here to speed things up, and just like with everything on these old buildings, things get really rusty after a few decades. Oil paints will do a very quick job on this front, but I won't be lying if I tell you that all of these tiny things, the trapdoor and the windows, took me longer than the big wall itself. However, it's also these very same details that bring life and realism to the miniature, because without them, it would just be a plain old boring brick wall. Let's finally address the elephant in the room, and the only part I wasn't too stoked about. If I'm honest, I enjoy painting large wooden doors much more than rusty ones. Also, the real sliding door is pretty wild when you break it down into individual layers, and I decided to replicate it as closely as I could. Not an easy job, so you can see why I wasn't looking forward to it. I kept the initial rust layers simplistic and sloppy, and I would never think that I'd be using purple to replicate dark rust. But here I am doing just that, lol. Now comes the obligatory layer of chipping fluid, and this one was especially generous because what comes next. And that is rather unconventional. I'd never imagined applying the ugliest airbrush job on purpose, but again, here we are. I used a very diluted mixture of Tamiya paints diluted with Mr. Leveling Thinner and tried blasting those spider legs down, following the direction of gravity. As you can imagine, chipping wasn't the easiest and the paint needed a lot of convincing, all because of the thinned down consistency, wet application and high pressure. All of this literally pushed it through the layer of chipping fluid, or rather the paint melted into the underlying layer. However, after several dozen minutes, I got the effect to my liking, but not enough to justify only one layer. The chipping fluid was still very much present, so I quickly applied an even thinner layer with more delicate spider legs, and chipped that one down as well. Once this was done, I mixed a matching tone from AK acrylics and did some fine brush painting, mainly to enhance the texture in some areas, and to apply more authentic runs of paint in a controlled manner, exactly where I wanted them. Each layer on the real gate is affected by corrosion, so I did some quick speckling with dark rusty acrylic, and this also enhances the crusty look of the gate. It pretty much steps in where hairspray chipping falls short. This paint was also applied as a diluted glaze, creating this upward gradient, again following my reference. After that, I gave it another coat of chipping fluid, and this time I mixed the light blue/turquoise color from AK acrylics and diluted it with VMS acrylic thinner. My airbrushing skills with pure acrylics are terrible, so I thought I'd turn that into my biggest strength here. But here's the secret nobody will tell you. You have to be good at something first before you can try to make it look terrible on purpose. As such, I didn't manage to replicate the effect of running paint at all. However, I can do that with brushes. It's not the fanciest approach, but if it works, then I'm not gonna complain. It should come as no surprise that by this point, despite my initial distaste for this part, I was fully locked in. I had the final result in my sights, I knew the path to it, and I wasn't this focused in a long time. The whole gate took me 9 hours to paint, and I did that in one uninterrupted painting session. It's also worth mentioning that despite my original plan, I did it all with acrylics. No oils or enamels were used here. Not because I wanted to do some weird challenge just for the sake of challenging myself, but because their use wasn't justified and I could comfortably replicate every effect with acrylics. I also like how these patches of paint are covering up the owner's phone number on the real thing. I remember a few years ago when I considered making the entire mill as a model, not as a facade, and thinking that putting a real phone number on a miniature wouldn't be very cash money, but the real world solved that issue for me. Of course, you don't have to follow the real building at all. In fact, I highly recommend everyone give it their own spin. When I'm making these old buildings, I'm strongly against graffiti. Even if a real building has been vandalized, I don't see it as a part of the aging process, and thus I don't include these in my models. However, here they are part of the story. The top one says "for sale" and the bottom one "no parking", which is also the name of this facade and the kit. And the small word is a town where the company is based in. Probably. Oh, and how could I forget? All of the painting on this facade was done with AK Interactive paints because I love them and I'm partnered up with them. So visit the affiliate link in the description and snatch some AK goodies as well using my sales coupon. Honestly, I could drag this process into an entire half-hour video, but I think it illustrates the approach pretty well. Needless to say, I'm extremely happy with the result, and I think it was the part that would make or break the project. Oh, and while we're at it, the real gate was spray painted without masking, so the turquoise paint is also all over the wall around it. It creates an interesting contrast where the part that was the main focus of the paint job has almost none of it left, yet the overspray is still there. Moving on to the finishing touches, I added the remaining cables made from copper wires and painted them with acrylics. A quick fake cable fastener on the turn cable, and we're all good. The accurate enamel signs in the kit will give you plenty of options to choose from, but I personally wouldn't add all of them, because the wall would become too cluttered. But that's just me. They give another realistic, delicate touch to the wall, that's for sure. I also tried to integrate the wall anchors a little further by adding visible rust streaks and stains on the brick wall. Now, gluing the wall and the base is a piece of cake with PVA glue. It fits like a jigsaw. However, I must have made a small oopsie when I was matching them together, and the base falls about a millimeter short. That's all on me, and I don't know how I didn't notice this issue, so you can either leave it as it is, seeing it is one of the nuances of handmade miniatures, or easily fill it with acrylic putty and some gentle sanding. I mean, this would be necessary anyway, just in smaller amounts, and it's easier and quicker than it looks, so don't be shy and fix my mistakes for me, okay? Painting the sides black gives the whole thing a luxurious look and also brings out the relief of the wall. Very, very nice. I'm a big fan of such little touches. Finally, let's address some remaining components, which I'll go through quickly as the techniques are somewhat repetitive. The zinc angle profiles used as roof flashing can be quickly painted with multiple shades of grey and white, and if you add a touch of blue, they look really nice. Zinc has a lot of random texture, so a stippling, squiggly motion with the paintbrush is helpful. Also, I can't think of a better duo when it comes to contrast. Zinc coating and rust is the crème de la crème. Once again, integration is essential, so don't be shy and put some of that sweet rust on the concrete as well. Tom also made a piece of asbestos roof paneling, which was very common here back in the day. You can still find it on old, neglected buildings or outhouses because safe disposal is expensive, and people would rather just keep it there and forget about its existence. Well, this was a nice surprise, although I didn't design the facade to have a roof. You can either put it up there or lay it on the ground in front of it as a piece of debris. I decided to keep mine without it, but I painted the part nonetheless for presentation purposes. The base needed a bit of natural debris for a more realistic look. I used sifted gardening substrate just like in my last diorama, soaked it with alcohol, and fixed it in place with VMS ballast freeze. A bit of AK acrylic mud texture was stippled and blended on the lower edge to make it look like a transition between the concrete foundation and the earth underneath. All of these effects were quickly painted with AK enamels, namely Rainmarks effects and earth. Super quick job, nothing fancy here. And finally, although Tom designed these as beer cans, I decided to paint them as the most divine drink on this planet. They received a coat of VMS gloss varnish and were good to go. There are countless ways to personalize your facade with debris, but I decided to keep mine simple and added just a few planks and sheets of plywood that I quickly scratch built from plastic. So while I'm putting it in a picture frame, which won't be part of the kit, let me give you my final thoughts. Just the sheer fact that there will be a model kit with my name slapped on it is something I never even considered dreaming about, and I guess my subconscious didn't consider it either. So you can trust me when I say that this is one of the highest honors for me, and I poured all my experience into the facade so that if you buy it, you can have a good time painting it. If you're interested, visit the link in the description and the pinned comment, because by the time this video comes out, Tom will be finishing the printed instructions, but pre-orders will be open and kits will start shipping in about a week or so. Let me know your thoughts. If you're interested in the kit, how are you gonna paint yours? Tell me everything. It should go without saying that each purchase helps me out, and if we see that you like the kit, we'll definitely make another one. I have countless ideas, it's just a matter of making something interesting out of them. Last but not least, check out my webpage where I'm displaying and selling my models, although I'm definitely keeping this one, and the Plastic Invasion store where you can find my merch. We still have 2 t-shirt designs, but we're already working on something new and more useful for our modeling needs. And with the photos of the finished wall, it's time to say my biggest thanks to every single one of you, because if it weren't for you, this would have never happened. It's a privilege which I'm not taking for granted, and I'm forever grateful for it. I must not forget my wonderful patrons whose generous support makes it possible for me to build models and film videos for a living, because YouTube's algorithm and AdSense are less predictable than April weather. My whole Patreon page is like a Night Shift magazine subscription, as I post there pretty often, and you'll get updates from my workbench where I share my thoughts and insights. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos and those stay there forever, so you can always get back to them. I also have some extra goodies such as 3D models which you can use for detailing your projects, a bunch of real-life references for nature, old buildings and so on. And last but not least, all of these high-resolution photos which show the facade in more detail than video ever could. It's appreciated but not expected. Thanks again, my friends, this was a great experience and I hope you'll enjoy this model as well. Thanks again, I love you all, and if you buy one, make sure it won't stay in your stash, but will paint a beautiful piece of history from my town. Cheers!